There are crimes that shock, and then there are crimes that permanently scar the national psyche, becoming an eternal, looping tragedy frozen in time. The murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey is one such wound. It is a crime so saturated with inexplicable contradiction, so defined by spectacular failure, and so perpetually haunted by the ghosts of what-ifs that nearly 3 decades later, the full file remains wide open, a constant reminder of justice denied. This is the story of a perfect American tableau that shattered in the most horrific way possible, a case that transformed a wealthy, privileged family in Boulder, Colorado, into the most scrutinized figures in modern criminal history, while transforming the victim, a 6-year-old girl, into an iconic, tragic, and deeply controversial symbol of innocence lost. To understand the depth of this tragedy, we must first understand the world JonBenét inhabited, a world built on aspiration and achievement, the very epitome of the late 20th century American dream. The Ramsey family lived at the apex of this world. John Ramsey, the patriarch, was a successful businessman, the CEO of Access Graphics, a computer software distribution company that was growing rapidly. Patsy Ramsey, the matriarch, was a former Miss West Virginia, a woman who cultivated an image of grace and southern charm, fiercely devoted to her children. They were a family of wealth, influence, and high social standing in the serene, liberal, intellectual community of Boulder. Their home, a massive Tudor-style mansion on 15th Street, was a fortress of success, a comfortable world far removed from the violent realities of the city. Their younger daughter, JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, born in 1990, was their centerpiece. With her striking blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and innate performance quality, she became a highly successful, almost professional child beauty pageant contestant. The imagery of JonBenét, caked in heavy stage makeup, draped in elaborate costumes, and smiling fixedly under the bright lights, will become central to the controversy and later, the public's immediate rush to judgment. To her parents, this was a charming, innocent hobby. To critics, it was a form of exploitation that spoke volumes about the family's obsession with image and perfection. JonBenét herself was described by those who knew her as a bright, happy, energetic, and slightly mischievous first grader, deeply loved by her parents and her older brother, Burke. The last day of her young life, December 25th, 1996, was, by all accounts, a picture classic festive American Christmas bliss. There were stockings, new bikes, a trip to the home of friends, and a quiet expectation of an early morning flight to Michigan for a post-holiday vacation. The Ramseys retired late that night, tired but content, their luxurious home holding the quiet echo of a perfect family Christmas. No alarms were raised, no sounds were heard. The house was locked, the world outside was quiet, and the family was secure in their wealth and social standing. Yet, in the silent, early hours of December 26, 1996, something monstrous entered that perfect tableau. Whether it came from within or without remains a central, defining question of this entire case. But its arrival was signaled not by a crash or a break-in, but by a chilling, quiet piece of paper left strategically on the grand staircase. The juxtaposition of the wealth, the beauty, the pageants, and the quiet, snow-dusted serenity of Boulder with the savage, brutal crime that unfolded inside those walls is what cemented this case's place in history. It wasn't just a murder. It was a cultural explosion, a direct challenge to the idea that wealth and isolation could truly protect innocence from the darkest human impulses. This chapter closes on a moment of awakening, the morning after Christmas, the moment the dream died and a nightmare began, signaling the start of catastrophic failure in justice and the beginning of relentless, unyielding public obsession that is yet to abate. The world would soon learn the name JonBenét Ramsey, but the world would never truly learn what happened that fateful night. The moment Patsy Ramsey descended the spiral staircase of her Boulder home on the morning of December 26, 1996, the world, as she knew it, ceased to exist. It was 5:52 a.m. She was not greeted by the sight of her daughter, JonBenét, excited by her new Christmas gifts. Instead, she found a peculiar object lying conspicuously on the steps, a 3-page handwritten letter. This letter, immediately identified as a ransom note, was the first concrete sign that the festive silence of the night had been violently violated. The sheer size and nature of the note immediately set off alarm bells, marking this case as profoundly different from any typical abduction. The note was composed on paper found inside the Ramsey home, written with a pen also belonging to the family, in a distinctive, sweeping script that Patsy Ramsey would later deny was her own, yet bore striking resemblances to her handwriting. Its contents were bizarre, demanding an exact, specific figure, $118,000. This precise amount, slightly above John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus, would become a pivotal, endlessly analyzed detail. The language of the note was also highly unusual, a strange, theatrical mix of dramatic, movie script cliches and corporate jargon, referring to a small group of individuals and threatening decapitation if the Ramseys contacted law enforcement or deviated from the strict instructions. The sheer length of the note was perhaps the most confounding detail for seasoned investigators. Most genuine ransom notes are short, frantic, and to the point, designed for speed and minimal risk of detection. This note, however, was a verbose, 3-page manifesto, taking a significant amount of time to write. A bold, high-risk endeavor for an intruder inside a sleeping family's home. The note instructed John Ramsey to withdraw the money immediately and wait for a call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. In a moment of panic and terror, Patsy Ramsey did the only thing she felt she could. She immediately called 911. Her call, frantic and bordering on hysteria, preserved on tape, is one of the most chilling audio documents in American crime history. However, in their extreme panic, the Ramseys may have already committed the first of several critical errors that would permanently taint the entire investigation. By immediately calling 911, Patsy disregarded the specific and highly emphasized instructions within the note, a fact that would later be used by detectives to suggest the note was never a true ransom demand, but a meticulously constructed, elaborate staging designed to buy time or misdirect investigators. The immediate arrival of the Boulder Police Department shattered any hope of a clean, isolated crime scene. The initial responding officer, Rick French, entered a house that was already compromised by panic, distraction, and a pervasive lack of protocol. The crime scene, the entire Ramsey residence, was instantly and tragically violated. Friends, family, and associates began to arrive at the home, invited by John and Patsy, ostensibly to offer support and await the call. But in reality, trampling potential evidence, moving objects, and contaminating the very spaces where forensic evidence might have been crucial. This initial chaos, documented in agonizing detail, would become the first major failure point, a foundational error that ensured that any clear, objective interpretation of the evidence would be impossibly difficult from that moment forward. The stage was set not just for a murder investigation, but for a profound, agonizing cultural and legal battle over the very nature of guilt and innocence. This chapter is a deep dive into the initial hours of confusion, the unique and theatrical nature of the ransom note, and the catastrophic, irreversible collapse of the crime scene integrity, a failure that guaranteed that the truth will remain permanently shrouded in doubt and the bitter fog of conflicting theories. The 911 call placed by Patsy Ramsey at 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996, is a pivotal piece of evidence, a raw, unfiltered sonic window into the exact moment the Ramsey's life was irrevocably shattered. Her voice, high-pitched, choked with fear, and bordering on the incoherent, conveyed genuine terror as she reported the kidnapping of her 6-year-old daughter. However, the tape contains a detail that would haunt the Ramseys and fuel the ensuing controversy for decades before the dispatcher could disconnect the line. A muffled, seemingly off-mic exchange was unintentionally captured, though fiercely debated. Some analysts claim the voices heard were those of John and Patsy, and possibly even the faint, almost imperceptible voice of their son, Burke, whispering something that was later argued to be, or not to be, crucial. This unintended recording instantly added a layer of profound suspicion and ambiguity to the Ramseys' claims of innocence, suggesting to some that the family was communicating about the staging or control and narrative in the immediate aftermath of the apparent abduction. The initial response of the Boulder Police Department was, tragically, marked by a pervasive, fundamental inexperience with major homicide investigations, compounded by a lack of appropriate urgency and a crippling adherence to established, yet entirely inappropriate, protocol. The first officers on scene treated the case as a routine, though high-profile, kidnapping. Their primary focus was a ransom call they were told to expect, not the systematic, meticulous preservation of a potential crime scene. This immediate misclassification proved fatal to the investigation. The police failed to immediately cordon off the perimeter. They failed to assign the necessary forensic technicians. And most critically, they failed to prevent the immediate influx of friends and family, the very people who unwittingly destroyed crucial forensic evidence. Detectives later admitted that they never believed the child had been successfully abducted, an assumption that was based largely on the bizarre nature of the ransom note and the unusual cooperation and behavior of the family. The note, demanding $118,000, was the exact amount of John Ramsey's annual bonus, a detail that led investigators to suspect an inside job, or at the very least, a crime staged by someone intimately familiar with the Ramseys' financial situation. This early, almost singular focus on the parents, known as the tunnel vision of the Boulder Police, ensured that crucial leads related to an external intruder were either ignored, discounted, or not pursued with the necessary resources and urgency. Hours passed as a family and police waited for the promised ransom call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. The call never came. This failure, coupled with the realization that the police had searched the main living areas but failed to thoroughly check the entire expanse of home, led to the next, most devastating stage of the investigation. At approximately 1:05 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, a key figure in the investigation, suggested to John Ramsey that he and a family friend conduct a more thorough search of the house, specifically asking him to check for anything out of the ordinary. This request, utterly bizarre in the context of a high-stakes kidnapping where police control should have been absolute, directly led to the discovery that sealed the case's tragic fate and ensured its permanent unsolved status. The failed police response, the lack of an immediate lockdown, the reliance on the family's narrative, and the ultimate instruction to the victim's father to conduct his own search remains the most profound and universally criticized aspect of the case. It is the core reason why, nearly 30 years later, investigators are still battling over a contaminated crime scene and the basic interpretation of evidence that should have been secured within the first 2 hours. The most agonizing moment in the entire chronology of the JonBenét Ramsey case occurred at 1:05 p.m. on December 26, 1996. After the promised ransom call never materialized, and upon the instruction of Detective Linda Arndt to conduct a personal search of the home, John Ramsey, accompanied by a family friend, began a deeper inspection of the Ramsey residence. His search led him inevitably to the basement, a dark, sprawling area of the immense Tudor home, a space that the initial police response had utterly failed to thoroughly inspect. The basement held several rooms, including a wine cellar, a train room, and a storage area. It was in one of these smaller, obscure storage areas, behind a door that Patsy had earlier claimed was locked or secured, that John Ramsey made the horrific discovery. There, partially covered by a white blanket, he found the body of his daughter, JonBenét. The supposed kidnapping was suddenly and brutally revealed to be a murder. The discovery itself immediately resulted in the most catastrophic, irreversible contamination of the primary crime scene. John Ramsey, in a state of utter shock and primal grief, immediately picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs. This single, devastating action, the removal of the victim from the exact location where she was found, destroyed an immeasurable amount of potential forensic evidence, forever blurring the lines of the scene. Any fibers, hairs, blood spatter patterns, or transfer evidence that might have definitively linked an assailant to the crime and the basement room was violently disrupted, scattered, and lost. The scene was further contaminated when Patsy Ramsey, upon seeing her daughter's body, collapsed over her, further compromising any potential evidence that might have been on JonBenét's clothing or skin. The police response to this discovery was equally flawed. Instead of immediately securing the house, removing the family, and calling in forensic specialists to lock down the location where the body was found, the officers on the scene were emotionally overwhelmed, focusing on the welfare of the parents rather than the clinical preservation of evidence. It was an investigation dominated by emotion, not objective protocol. The immediate physical evidence at the scene was chilling. JonBenét was found with cord around her neck, attached to a crude wooden garrote, a homemade device that had been tightened, causing asphyxia. She had also suffered a severe blow to the head, a massive skull fracture that alone could have been fatal. Her hands were bound above her head, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. This elaborate, ritualistic presentation of the victim further complicated the narrative. Was it the work of a seasoned, sexually motivated predator, or the over-the-top staging of someone desperate to make an inside job look like a kidnapping? The nature of the weapons, the cord and garrote, were later identified as having been constructed from items found within the Ramsey home, specifically a piece of nylon cord and the paintbrush handle used to create the tightening mechanism. This fact became the foundational pillar of the family did it theory, suggesting that the killer had easy, intimate access to the house and its contents. The contamination of the crime scene, coupled with the immediate focus on the family, created a perfect storm of doubt and conflicting evidence. The discovery in the basement confirmed the police's initial fatal assumption. The child was never truly kidnapped. She had been murdered within the confines of her own home. The case instantly pivoted from a missing persons investigation to a homicide, but by the time the proper forensic teams were finally brought in hours later, the chance for a clean, definitive analysis had been lost forever, ensuring that the critical, silent details of the crime would remain ambiguous, forever open to relentless, agonizing interpretation. The autopsy performed on JonBenét Ramsey provided the first objective, clinical, and undeniable facts about the brutality of her final moments. Yet even these stark medical details served only to deepen profound mystery and fuel the conflicting theories that plague the case to this day. Conducted in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the forensic examination revealed two distinct fatal traumas: a severe craniocerebral trauma caused by a massive blow to head, and asphyxia by strangulation caused by the crude ligature found around her neck. This combination of fatal injuries immediately suggested a crime of extreme violence, driven either by uncontrollable rage or a calculated, ritualistic intent. The head injury was devastating. The pathologist determined that JonBenét had suffered an 8-inch fracture to the right side of her skull, a massive injury caused by a blunt force trauma. This blow alone would have rendered her unconscious almost instantly and likely led to death. The nature of the weapon used to inflict this trauma remains unknown, though investigators searched fruitlessly for a tool within the home that matched the injury's distinct dimensions. Theories range from a flashlight to a golf club or even a heavy piece of equipment found in the basement, but no definitive murder weapon for the head trauma was ever publicly identified. Compounding this trauma was the asphyxia. The garrote, crafted from a length of cord and the handle of a paintbrush, was found tightly secured around her neck. The pathologist confirmed that the strangulation was inflicted before death, meaning the killer actively worked to ensure her demise even after the devastating blow to the head. The combination of these two brutal acts suggested a highly personal, deeply aggressive attack that went far beyond what was strictly necessary to simply kill the child. Crucially, the autopsy confirmed that JonBenét had been sexually assaulted. While the details remain intensely private and medically graphic, the presence of specific injuries confirmed sexual molestation had occurred shortly before or around the time of her death. This finding immediately introduced a profile of a sexual predator into the case, supporting the long-standing intruder theory that posits a stranger entered the home with criminal intent. However, the complexity was further amplified by the presence of blood and DNA evidence. The analysis revealed DNA, specifically touch DNA, from an unknown male under JonBenét's fingernails and on her underwear. This trace evidence, minute yet undeniably present, became the single most powerful, objective evidence suggesting the presence of an external killer. Yet, even this scientific evidence was fraught with controversy. Could the DNA have been transferred DNA from a factory worker who manufactured her clothing? could have been from a completely innocent third party who somehow unknowingly contaminated the item. The debate over the source and significance of this touch DNA continues to be the central scientific battleground of the case, preventing a definitive conclusion. Finally, the autopsy confirmed the timing. Though the precise time of death was difficult to pin down due to the complexities of the various traumas, the contents of her stomach, undigested pineapple and grapes, suggested she was killed relatively soon after consuming a late-night snack. Patsy and John Ramsey would later deny that JonBenét had eaten pineapple on Christmas night, a small but critical detail that became another point of suspicion for police, suggesting the parents were actively concealing or misremembering crucial aspects of the night. The medical facts were clear. JonBenét died from a combination of massive head trauma and strangulation following a sexual assault. But the identity of the person who inflicted these horrific injuries remained, and still remains, completely concealed by the lack of definitive, uncontaminated evidence in the complex, contradictory story told by the crime scene itself. Among the immediate, shocking discoveries made on the morning of December 26, 1996, the ransom note stands alone as the single most bizarre and controversial piece of documentary evidence in the history of American crime. Its very existence, its unusual length, and its theatrical language immediately transformed the case from a routine abduction into a profound psychological mystery, immediately suggesting that the perpetrator was neither a professional criminal nor a random intruder, but someone intimately connected to the drama being played out inside the Ramsey home. The note was discovered by Patsy Ramsey on the spiral staircase, neatly composed on paper torn from a notepad found inside the Ramsey home, and written with a black felt-tip pen also traced back to the residence. This in-house origin of the materials was the first powerful flag for the police, suggesting that the writer felt secure enough to spend a significant amount of time, estimated to be at least 15 to 20 minutes, writing a complex, multi-page manifesto while the family was sleeping upstairs. A genuine external kidnapper would typically seek speed, efficiency, and distance from the crime scene, not linger to compose a 3-page letter. The contents of the note were even more bewildering. It was addressed to John Ramsey and signed by a small foreign faction with collective initial of SBTC. The language was a highly theatrical, strange blend of corporate terminology, referencing a business transaction and emphasizing negotiations, and highly melodramatic, cinematic threats, including the explicit warning of decapitation should the Ramseys contact law enforcement or deviate from the instructions. It read like a bad screenplay, not a genuine criminal demand. The most precise and scrutinized detail was the ransom amount itself, $118,000. John Ramsey later confirmed that this figure was very close to the exact amount of recent annual bonus he had received, a piece of intimate financial information that strongly implied the writer had detailed, insider knowledge of the Ramsey family's personal finances. For the Boulder Police, the specific amount was a critical tipping point, solidifying their initial belief that the note was an elaborate staging, a cover story created by someone inside the home, desperate to make a murder look like a kidnapping. The note commanded John to withdraw the money immediately and wait for a phone call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. This instruction, coupled with the explicit warning not to contact the authorities, was immediately violated by Patsy Ramsey when she called 911. Investigators later argued that a genuine kidnapper would have tracked this violation and called off the operation or threatened retaliation, but the promised call never came, further reinforcing suspicion that the note was never intended to be followed through on. Forensic document examiners, who meticulously studied the note's handwriting, further intensified the controversy. While some experts hired by the police suggested that Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded as a writer, other world-renowned experts concluded that the writing exhibited genuine attempts at disguise, a conscious effort to alter natural handwriting patterns, and that while there were similarities to Patsy's script, the evidence was not conclusive enough to declare her the author. The debate over authorship continues to rage, with some arguing the unique linguistic pattern suggests a woman with Southern education, Patsy, and others arguing the structure points toward a man attempting to mimic a woman's hand or affect a sophisticated, fictional persona. This extraordinary document is not merely evidence. It is a psychological artifact that captures the strange confluence of wealth, performance, and terror that define the case. Its verbose nature and internal contradictions ensure that from day one, the investigation would be polarized, forever locked in a debate over whether the note was a genuine, albeit bizarre, demand from an intruder or the desperate, flawed invention of a parent trying by time and deflect suspicion from a crime committed within the perfect, shattering walls of their own home. The initial hours following Patsy Ramsey's 911 call and the subsequent discovery of JonBenét's body in the basement were marked by an immediate and catastrophic convergence of institutional failure and media saturation that irrevocably tainted the investigation. The moment the case hit the national news, fueled by the shocking juxtaposition of the child beauty queen and the bizarre 3-page ransom note, the narrative of the case was seized by the press and, fatally, began to outpace the actual police work. The Boulder Police Department, BPD, inexperienced with a complex, high-profile homicide, immediately struggled under the intense global spotlight. Their response was marked by a fundamental strategic error. They quickly zeroed in on the parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, as the primary suspects. This tunnel vision was based on a compelling, yet ultimately circumstantial trifecta of initial suspicions: the in-house origin of the ransom note and writing materials, the precise financial demand, $118,000, that matched John's bonus, and perception that the Ramseys' behavior, their refusal to submit to immediate, open-ended interviews without their high-powered attorneys present, was highly uncooperative and indicative of guilt. This early focus became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every subsequent piece of evidence, regardless of its objective merit, was filtered through the lens of staging. The garrote, crafted from a Ramsey paintbrush and cord, was seen as evidence of a family member trying to frame an outsider. The lack of a forced entry, prior to the later discovery of the broken window, was interpreted as proof that the killer had a key or was let in. The Ramseys' image, the wealth, the pageant costumes, the initial reluctance to speak, was devoured by the media and presented to the public as a motive for the crime, suggesting a pathology hidden beneath the veneer of perfection. The media frenzy was unprecedented. Helicopters hovered over the Ramsey mansion. Every detail of JonBenét's life was exposed, and Patsy Ramsey's tearful televised appeals were dissected by millions as either genuine grief or Oscar-worthy performance. This constant, unrelenting pressure from the press further isolated the Ramseys and, ironically, solidified their determination to maintain distance from the Boulder Police, which only increased the investigators' suspicion. While the BPD focused narrowly on the Ramseys, crucial time was lost in investigating alternative leads and securing the wider neighborhood. Potential external witnesses were interviewed too late, or leads related to known sex offenders in the area were not pursued with the necessary urgency. The entire investigation became a battle of public perception. The police, attempting to appear competent, insisted the killer was inside the home, while the Ramseys, using their immense wealth to hire expert defense attorneys and private investigators, fought a high-stakes public relations war to prove the existence of an intruder. This relentless, early focus on the family, driven by circumstance and amplified by the media, fundamentally crippled the investigation. It meant that when the objective scientific evidence finally emerged years later, the undeniable unknown male DNA, the police were too entrenched in their original dogma to fully pivot, ensuring that the Ramseys would remain perpetually implicated in the eyes of many, and the true killer would remain hidden in the shadow cast by the initial catastrophic investigative misdirection. The battle between the circumstantial evidence pointing inward and the scientific evidence pointing outward continues to define the entire tragic history of the case. The interviews with John and Patsy Ramsey in the immediate aftermath of their daughter's murder were, perhaps, the most damaging elements to their public image and the most critical source of suspicion for the Boulder Police Department. The Ramseys' decision to delay their formal, in-depth interviews for weeks, speaking only through short, carefully crafted public statements and supervised television appearances, was interpreted by investigators as a calculated obstruction of justice and the behavior of guilty parents attempting to construct a plausible narrative. For law enforcement, The ideal victim's family is cooperative, desperate to assist, and immediately available for exhaustive questioning. The Ramsey strategy, driven by their attorneys, was the antithesis of this, establishing an adversarial relationship with the police from day one that never truly healed. The police viewed their demand for legal counsel and their reluctance to share details as a clear indication that they were hiding something far more sinister than parental grief. When the formal interviews finally took place, the content of their testimony was dissected for contradictions and subtle clues. The police noted what they perceived as inconsistencies in the Ramseys' timelines of Christmas night. Patsy's inability to definitively recall giving JonBenét pineapple, despite the autopsy revealing undigested pineapple in her stomach, was a critical point of suspicion that fueled the accidental death theory. Her writing style, which was compared to the bizarre ransom note, also contributed significantly to the police's relentless focus on her as a potential author and stager of the crime. Beyond the verbal testimony, the Ramseys' nonverbal communication, their body language during public appearances, was subjected to intense, often amateur, scrutiny by the media and less formally by some investigators. Patsy's perceived theatricality, her emotional peaks and valleys, and John's seemingly reserved, corporate demeanor were all interpreted by the court of public opinion as signs of deception rather than expressions of grief under extreme duress. Psychologists and body language experts, many without direct access to the Ramseys, offered widely circulated interpretations that painted the parents as deceptive, manipulative, and detached from the reality of the tragedy. However, the Ramseys and their defense team fiercely argued that their behavior was entirely understandable given the circumstances. They were wealthy, high-profile targets in a highly media-saturated environment, and their trust in the Boulder Police had been destroyed by the initial mishandling of the crime scene and the immediate public accusation of guilt. Their legal strategy, while disastrous for their public perception, was designed to protect them from a police force they believed was hell-bent on framing them. They argued that any wealthy family would have immediately sought legal counsel to shield themselves from an aggressive, error-prone investigation. This fundamental conflict over the Ramseys' cooperation became a central, insurmountable wall in an investigation. To the police, the lack of immediate, unconditional access was proof of guilt. To the Ramseys, the police's refusal to consider an intruder was evidence of institutional incompetence and corruption. The interviews, therefore, failed to establish clear facts and instead became a psychological battleground, ensuring that the public perception of the Ramseys as potentially guilty would linger indefinitely, regardless of the eventual exonerations based on scientific DNA evidence. The emotional ambiguity of their responses remains one of the most frustrating and analyzed components of the full case file. By the late 1990s, the JonBenét Ramsey investigation had descended into a frustrating, politically charged stalemate, defined by the Boulder Police Department's strong, public conviction of the Ramseys' guilt and the district attorney's reluctance to file charges due to insufficient forensic evidence. To break this impasse and bring some legal authority to bear, a grand jury was convened in 1998, a secret, closed-door proceeding designed to review the entire body of evidence and determine if probable cause existed to file criminal charges against John and Patsy Ramsey. The grand jury process, which lasted more than 13 months, was a secretive and intense legal battle, allowing prosecutors to subpoena witnesses, present thousands of pages of police reports, and introduce all forensic analysis without the rigorous cross-examination required in an open trial. The police, convinced of their staging theory, presented evidence suggesting the Ramseys had written a ransom note and covered up an accidental death. They focused on the circumstantial evidence, the in-house materials, the strange ransom amount, the contradictions in the interviews, and the contamination of the scene. The Ramseys' defense team, though barred in the proceedings, mounted a powerful public counteroffensive, continuously leaking evidence to the media that supported the intruder theory, including the existence of foreign male DNA and the findings of their own private investigator, Lou Smith. The climax of this process arrived in October 1999 when the grand jury completed its review. The sealed verdict, leaked years later in 2013, delivered a stunning and deeply controversial finding. The grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey. The indictment charges, however, were not for the murder itself, but for child abuse resulting in death and obstruction of justice. This was a pivotal moment, as the grand jury essentially concluded that the Ramseys were involved in the circumstances surrounding JonBenét's death and took actions to prevent the discovery of the crime, supporting the cover-up theory. However, the legal maneuver that followed ensured the case remained cold. The then district attorney, Alex Hunter, made the unprecedented, controversial decision to not sign the indictment. Hunter argued that while the grand jury found probable cause, he believed the evidence presented was insufficient to meet the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt required to secure a conviction at trial. He feared that charging the Ramseys would lead to an acquittal, which would permanently exonerate them and allow the true killer to escape justice. Hunter's decision was immediately met with a firestorm of criticism. To the police, it was a political capitulation. To the public, it was proof that the wealthy could literally buy their way out of justice. To the Ramseys, it was an agonizing limbo. They were not acquitted, but they were not charged either. This withheld decision created a permanent legal and psychological scar. The Ramseys remained in perpetual legal and public limbo, perpetually suspected, yet never tried. The grand jury's secret indictment, though legally moot due to Hunter's refusal to sign, ensured that the circumstantial theory of parental cover-up will remain a dominant narrative for decades, even as a scientific evidence. The DNA grew stronger in favor of the intruder theory. The episode cemented the legal and political tragedy of the case, highlighting the profound chasm between circumstantial suspicion and the stringent demands of criminal law. While the Boulder Police Department remained fixated on the family, the intruder theory, the proposition that a male sexual predator broke into the Ramsey home and murdered JonBenét, was persistently and compellingly advanced by independent investigators, most notably the legendary detective Lou Smith and by the Ramsey's own defense team. This theory relies on compelling, physical evidence that was consistently overlooked or dismissed by the initial police response. The first major piece of evidence is the basement window. While the police initially claimed there was no forced entry, investigators later confirmed the presence of a broken window in the basement. This window, located in a window well, was found to be slightly ajar or easily opened, and the window screen outside was damaged or removed. Crucially, the discovery of a large, undisturbed spider web inside the window well became a key point of contention. Lou Smith argued that if John Ramsey had staged the break-in by breaking the glass from the outside, the spider web would have been destroyed. The fact that the web was intact suggested the break-in may have occurred from the outside, with a small individual squeezing through the narrow opening, or that the window was already partially damaged or ajar. This suggested a vulnerable, plausible point of entry. The second major piece of physical evidence was a footprint. A distinct, partial footprint of a shoe or boot was discovered on a suitcase found beneath the broken basement window, which investigators theorize the intruder may have used to climb down or stabilize themselves upon entry. This print did not match any footwear belonging to the Ramsey family, lending credence to the presence of an external party. Furthermore, the meticulous construction of the garrote, crafted from a piece of cord and a piece of a Ramsey-owned paintbrush handle, was reinterpreted not as the work of a staging parent, but as a signature act of a sexually sadistic, organized killer who utilized readily available materials within the home. The 3-page ransom note, with its theatrical and verbose language, was also viewed as a key element of the intruder's modus operandi, a deliberate distraction and a manifestation of the killer's psychological need to prolong the drama and display a perverse sense of control and superiority. They argued that the language was too bizarre and too heavily influenced by cinematic cliches to be a genuine attempt at obstruction by the highly educated Patsy Ramsey, instead suggesting a strange fantasy enacted by an outsider. Perhaps the most compelling, though less often discussed, evidence supporting the intruder theory was the open garage door. The Ramseys often left their side garage door unlocked or slightly ajar, a fact known to many people in their social circle and neighborhood. This easily accessible point, far simpler than the broken window, could have provided the initial access to the home, allowing an intruder to move to the basement undisturbed. However, the ultimate scientific pillar of the intruder theory is the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails. This genetic material, which definitively did not belong to any member of the Ramsey family, provides the strongest objective evidence that a stranger committed the assault and murder. The intruder theory posits a stranger entered the home via the window or garage, committed the sexual assault and murder in the basement, left the elaborate note as a cover, and then exited the home, leaving behind only the single, crucial piece of DNA evidence that has yet to be matched to an identity. This theory stands as a perpetual counter-narrative to the initial police focus, a testament to the ignored evidence that continues to challenge the official narrative. In the early, chaotic hours of the investigation, before the media storm reaches crescendo, a crucial, microscopic piece of evidence was collected that holds the potential to solve the JonBenét Ramsey murder: the DNA of an unknown male. This trace evidence, initially dismissed or minimized by the Boulder Police due to their intense focus on the Ramsey family, would eventually become the single most objective and powerful argument supporting the intruder theory. Its very existence acts as a silent, scientific counterpoint to the circumstantial evidence that long pointed the finger inward. The first collection of this material was made during the autopsy, under JonBenét's fingernails. Consistent with a struggle she may have put up against her attacker, forensic scientists recovered biological material. More significantly, trace amounts of semen and other genetic material were found on her underwear and clothing, collected as part of the post-mortem examination. Early testing of this material was rudimentary by modern standards, leading to inconclusive results. However, as DNA technology, specifically techniques like polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, advanced dramatically in the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators were able to revisit these minute samples. The results were startlingly clear. The DNA belonged to an unidentified male, a profile that did not match John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey, or any other known individual connected to the case. This specific profile was loaded into the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, the National Database of Criminal Offenders, where it has returned 0 matches for nearly 3 decades. This established DNA profile, commonly referred to as unknown male DNA or the foreign DNA, became the cornerstone of the case. Its presence undeniably confirmed that a male, other than the immediate family, had been in direct physical contact with JonBenét at the time of the sexual assault and murder. For those advocating the intruder theory, the case should have ended here. The scientific evidence should have immediately redirected the entire investigation toward finding the owner of this genetic fingerprint. Yet, the Boulder Police Department, still entrenched in its initial belief that the crime was an inside job, continued to grapple with the possibility of contamination. Could this DNA have been deposited innocently? The concept of touch DNA, minute genetic traces left behind through casual contact, complicated matters. Defense attorneys and some forensic experts propose that the DNA might have come from a factory worker who handled her clothing before it was shipped, or perhaps from innocent transfer by third parties. However, the presence of the genetic material on 2 different items, her clothing and under her fingernails, makes the contamination argument a difficult one to sustain credibly without extraordinary coincidence. The controversy surrounding the DNA reached its climax in 2008 when the district attorney at the time, Mary Lacey, publicly exonerated the Ramsey family based on these enhanced DNA findings. Lacey issued a public apology and declared that the family was cleared by the forensic evidence, confirming the belief that an intruder was responsible. Despite this, the Boulder Police Department, still haunted by its original theories and critical missteps, has never fully embraced the exoneration, nor have they publicly declared the Ramseys officially innocent. The enduring problem is the quality and quantity of the DNA sample. While a full profile exists, the amount of material is so minuscule that any subsequent testing risks consuming the entire sample, destroying the only existing physical evidence that could definitively identify the killer. The entire case now rests on the hope that genetic genealogy, using familial connections to trace the profile, or advanced forensic techniques will eventually break the almost 3-decade-old silence of the unknown male DNA, a silent witness whose identity holds the absolute key to unlocking this persistent American nightmare. As the Boulder Police Department continued its relentless, public, and often clumsy focus on the Ramsey family, a powerful and credible voice emerged from the law enforcement community that fundamentally challenged the direction of the investigation. Detective Lou Smith, a legendary investigator from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, Smith was recruited to the Ramsey case in 1997, a year after murder, to bring fresh eyes and a degree of impartial expertise to the increasingly poisoned and politically charged investigation. Smith's background was stellar. He was a master of detail, a man who believed the physical evidence always spoke the loudest. Unlike the entrenched Boulder Police, who seemed predetermined to see the family as guilty, Smith entered the Ramsey home with an open mind and a professional mandate to follow all leads, internal and external. What Smith found was not a carefully staged scene, but compelling, physical evidence of an intrusion, details that the Boulder Police had either overlooked or actively discounted. Smith's methodical, almost obsessive investigation quickly centered on the intruder theory, culminating in the now famous White Letter. Smith's official letter of resignation from the case, a document that became a powerful public indictment of the Boulder Police Department's tunnel vision. Smith's findings were groundbreaking. First, he identified an undisturbed cobweb across the small, broken basement window, arguing that if John Ramsey had broken a window during a staged break-in, the cobweb would have been damaged. Second, he confirmed the presence of the foreign male DNA on JonBenét's clothing, seeing it as definitive proof that an unknown assailant had committed the assault and murder. Third, Smith meticulously studied the elaborate construction of the garrote and the writing of the 3-page ransom note, arguing that the note's language and length were consistent with a person acting out a fantasy, likely derived from pop culture references, rather than the quick, pragmatic staging of a parent. He also found a distinct boot print near the wine cellar door that did not match any footwear owned by the Ramseys. Crucially, Smith believed he found a key entry point, a rarely used, highly obscure basement window that was found open, a place easily accessible to a small, agile intruder who could have leveraged a window well grate or other nearby object for access. This physical evidence, which painted a consistent picture of external access, was summarily rejected by the Boulder Police hierarchy. Frustrated by the department's refusal to shift its focus away from the Ramseys and its perceived deliberate withholding or misinterpretation of exculpatory evidence, Lou Smith resigned in September 1998. The White Letter, addressed to then District Attorney Alex Hunter, was not merely a resignation. It was a public declaration of his firm belief that an intruder, a specific sexual predator, had entered the home and murdered JonBenét. Smith's resignation immediately split the public and legal opinion on the case. It lent massive credibility to the Ramseys' defense and cemented the intruder theory in the public consciousness, forcing the media and future investigators to consider the evidence that lay outside the family circle. Until his death in 2010, Smith continued to pursue the case independently, creating his own database of potential suspects, a relentless pursuit of truth that was driven by the conviction that the Boulder Police had failed not only the Ramseys, but, most profoundly, the victim, JonBenét. The legacy of Lou Smith is one of professional integrity versus institutional failure, a lone voice of reason in an investigation consumed by misjudgment and media pressure, a voice that ensured the intruder theory will remain permanently at the forefront of the quest for justice. In the narrative of the JonBenét Ramsey tragedy, the figure of the older brother, Burke Ramsey, remains one of the most mysterious and perpetually scrutinized. Just 9 years old at the time of the murder, Burke was physically present in the Ramsey home when his sister was killed. Despite being cleared by law enforcement in later years and his family's insistence on his innocence, the public and various independent investigators have consistently scrutinized his involvement, largely fueled by a persistent theory known as the pineapple theory. This theory suggests that the underlying cause of JonBenét's death was not a botched kidnapping, but a tragic accident or act of rage within the family, which was then covered up by John and Patsy. The evidence supporting this theory hinges on a single, seemingly minor forensic detail: the undigested pineapple found in JonBenét's digestive tract during her autopsy. The pathologist estimated that the pineapple and grapes she ate were consumed shortly before her death, possibly an hour or two prior. When initially questioned, John and Patsy Ramsey vehemently denied giving JonBenét pineapple that night, a denial that immediately raised suspicion among Boulder Police, who viewed it as a sign of purposeful deception. Investigators then found a bowl of pineapple with milk on the kitchen table, a detail that suggested someone in the house had been eating it late at night. The theory that emerged and was later championed in several high-profile legal documents and media portrayals was that Burke Ramsey, perhaps a jealous or disturbed older brother, had become angry at JonBenét over the snack. In a fit of accidental rage, possibly wielding a heavy object, he allegedly struck his sister on the head, inflicting the fatal cranial trauma. John and Patsy, supposedly waking to the accident, then entered into a pact of silence, staging an elaborate ransom note and a garrote to cover up the accidental death and protect their surviving son. Burke's public demeanor, particularly his delayed public interviews decades later where he exhibited what some analysts described as unusual or detached behavior, only fueled the public's suspicions. His lawyers, however, firmly maintained that Burke was asleep throughout the entire event, and that the pineapple theory was baseless speculation built on circumstantial evidence and misinterpretation of the facts. They vehemently argued that the DNA evidence of the unknown male fundamentally refuted any theory of an inside job. The legal ramifications of this scrutiny were immense. Burke Ramsey successfully filed significant defamation lawsuits against several media organizations that publicly advanced the theory of his guilt, resulting in substantial financial settlements that forced a degree of public retraction and caution. Regardless of the legal outcomes, the pineapple theory and the question of Burke's knowledge remain a central, agonizing note of the case. The enduring question is whether the massive, calculated staging, the 3-page note, the complex garrote, the hidden body, was the work of a stranger with sexual motive or a desperate, elaborate, and ultimately flawed attempt by two wealthy parents to conceal a devastating, sudden tragedy that originated from within the confines of their perfect, shattered family home. The public's initial fascination with the JonBenét Ramsey case was not solely driven by the mystery of the crime itself, but by the stark, uncomfortable imagery of the victim, a 6-year-old child beauty queen. This aspect of JonBenét's life, the world of pageantry, became a lightning rod for national controversy, fueling a narrative of potential exploitation and pathology that, while never proving guilt, significantly tainted the public perception of the Ramsey family and the environment JonBenét grew up in. The extensive media coverage immediately latched onto the pageant photos, featuring JonBenét in full makeup, ornate costumes, and often provocative poses. For many, this imagery was disturbing, suggesting that the child was forced to live out an adult fantasy, placing her in a potentially vulnerable and inappropriate position. This lifestyle clashed dramatically with the conventional image of the innocent, suburban victim, and critics immediately suggested the pageants fostered an unhealthy environment obsessed with adult appearance and performance. Patsy Ramsey, herself a former beauty queen, was a driving force behind JonBenét's participation. She argued that the pageants were simply a fun mother-daughter bonding activity, a chance for JonBenét to express herself and build confidence. However, some independent investigators and psychologists argued that the pageantry environment could have attracted predatory individuals or, conversely, may have contributed to a strained family dynamic or psychological instability within the home that ultimately led to murder. The pageant world theory posits that the killer was someone intimately connected to this circuit, a disgruntled competitor, a stalker who followed JonBenét from competition, or someone who gained access to the Ramsey home through the perceived vulnerability or exposure associated with her public persona. Investigators did, in fact, interview numerous individuals associated with the child pageant circuit, including photographers, competitors, and event organizers, looking for someone who might have developed an obsession with the young star. The ransom note itself, with its highly theatrical, almost cinematic language, was also scrutinized through the lens of the pageant world. Some analysts argued that the note's dramatic flair and over-the-top threats were consistent with the kind of high-stakes, performance-driven mindset that permeated the highly competitive and sometimes psychologically strained atmosphere of child beauty competitions. A key, though later discredited, figure to emerge from this theory was a man named Bill McReynolds, who had portrayed Santa Claus at the Ramsey Christmas party just days before the murder. His connection to the family and his role as performer made him an early focus of suspicion, which faded after he provided a strong alibi. Furthermore, the theory about the staged nature of the crime, the rope, the garrote, the note, was frequently interpreted by critics as a direct reflection of the Ramseys' own obsession with dramatic performance and control, suggesting the staging was built upon the emotional architecture of the pageant stage itself. Ultimately, while the pageant world did not provide the identity of the killer, it profoundly shaped the public's perception. It provided a powerful, visual, and highly accessible narrative that cast immediate, pervasive doubt on the Ramseys, leading many to believe that the crime was somehow a dark, inevitable consequence of their lifestyle. This chapter, therefore, explores how a seemingly innocent hobby transformed into a national pathology, demonstrating how the very image of JonBenét became a weapon against her own family in the unrelenting court of public opinion. Years after the case had slipped from the front pages, mired in legal battles and investigative inertia, a shocking event reignited the global frenzy: the 2006 arrest of John Mark Carr. This sensational development, initially hailed as a major breakthrough, quickly devolved into one of the most embarrassing and dramatic diversions in the history of American true crime, highlighting the desperate, almost pathological need for a resolution to the JonBenét Ramsey case. Carr, a former school teacher with troubled past and a fascination with the Ramsey case, was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, after an intense, long-distance electronic correspondence with a freelance journalist. Carr stunned the world by confessing to the murder of JonBenét, claiming he had been with her when she died, and even providing details that seemed to align with aspects of the crime. The immediate public reaction was immense relief mixed with horror. For the first time in a decade, it seemed justice was finally within reach, and the mysterious identity of the killer was revealed. However, the initial euphoria quickly evaporated under the scrutiny of actual investigators. When Carr was extradited back to the United States, his confession began to unravel spectacularly. Carr's narrative was riddled with factual inconsistencies and outright falsehoods that a genuine killer would never have made. He claimed, for instance, that he had sexually assaulted JonBenét after her death, a detail that contradicted the medical examiner's report. Crucially, Carr failed to demonstrate any intimate knowledge of the Ramsey home or the unique details of the crime, such as the construction of the garrote or the specific contents of the 3-page ransom note. It became clear that Carr had fabricated his confession entirely, having gleaned all his purported knowledge from extensive, obsessive media coverage of the case. The final, definitive nail in the coffin of Carr's confession came from the forensic evidence. Investigators compared Carr's DNA to the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails. The results were immediate and conclusive. John Mark Carr was not a match. He had absolutely no connection to the actual crime scene and was immediately released from custody, a deeply troubled man whose desire for fame or notoriety had led him to insert himself into a national tragedy. The entire Carr episode was a profound indictment of the media's rush to judgment and the law enforcement's understandable but ultimately damaging desperation for a resolution. The sensational nature of the arrest overshadowed the meticulous, tedious work of following up on the genuine DNA evidence. It proved that the emotional hunger for a simple answer, the desire to fit a known, available suspect into the existing narrative, was stronger than commitment to following the cold, scientific facts. The Carr diversion did more than just waste valuable resources. It reinforced the toxic environment surrounding the case, proving how easily the pursuit of truth could be hijacked by spectacle and pathological self-insertion. It temporarily derailed the focus on the only credible physical evidence in the case, the unknown male DNA, and once again exposed the inherent challenges of investigating a case so deeply embedded in public hysteria and conflicting narratives. Ultimately, John Mark Carr remains a disturbing footnote, a tragic figure who provided the world with a temporary, false answer, only confirmed that the real killer was still out there, hidden in plain sight. His DNA profile a constant, quiet challenge to the entire American justice system. The presence of the unknown male DNA on JonBenét Ramsey's clothing is the most crucial, yet most fiercely debated piece of evidence in the entire case. While its existence scientifically exonerated the Ramseys in the eyes of some legal bodies, it simultaneously sparked an intense, complex forensic debate known as the industry theory or the contamination theory, primarily advanced by those who still firmly believe the crime was committed by a family member. This theory attempts to explain the presence of the foreign DNA profile by suggesting it was not deposited by the killer at the time of the murder, but rather introduced innocently at an earlier stage, thus making it irrelevant to the actual crime. The primary argument of the industry theory is that the DNA, which was largely touch DNA, minute skin cells, was transferred to JonBenét's clothing during the manufacturing process. Since much of her clothing was mass-produced in factories, likely overseas, the theory posits that a worker, potentially an employee at the garment factory or a packer, handled the fabric or the finished garment, leaving behind their trace DNA. This DNA would then have remained dormant until it was collected by forensic teams in 1996. This theory gained some traction because touch DNA is notoriously fragile and highly susceptible to secondary transfer, meaning it can be moved from one object to another without direct contact by the original person. However, this theory is met with severe, objective counterarguments from leading forensic scientists. The first major hurdle for the contamination theory is the specific location of the DNA. The genetic material was found in two separate, critical locations: on her underwear, which was the site of the sexual assault, and critically, under her fingernails, strongly suggesting a direct, physical struggle between the victim and the assailant. For the industry theory to be true, one must accept a series of improbable coincidences. That the same unknown male DNA was innocently transferred from a factory process to both her clothing and somehow transferred her fingernails via secondary means, and that the owner of this DNA happens to be the same person whose genetic material would logically be expected at the scene of a sexual assault. The sheer probability of this sequence of events is statistically minute. Secondly, some forensic analysts have argued that the amount and composition of the DNA found was inconsistent with casual, pre-crime transfer. While classified as touch DNA, some of the material recovered suggested the presence of bodily fluids, which significantly strengthens the argument that the DNA was deposited during the violent, sexual commission of the crime itself, not during the handling of clothing in a manufacturing plant months or years earlier. The contamination theory, therefore, serves a dual purpose in the context of the Ramsey case. For the defense, it provides an innocent explanation for the only solid piece of physical evidence that clearly points to an intruder. For those who believe the parents are guilty, it provides a means to dismiss the DNA evidence and maintain their focus on the circumstantial evidence of the staged note and the lack of cooperation. In the ongoing pursuit of justice, law enforcement faces a perpetual challenge of verifying the industry theory versus pursuing the unknown male DNA profile as the single, most critical lead. The entire weight of solving this cold case hinges on whether the DNA is a false flag, an anomaly, or the definitive fingerprint of the actual killer, a debate that underscores the forensic complexities and lingering legal agony of the JonBenét Ramsey murder. The enduring failure to solve the JonBenét Ramsey murder is not merely a consequence of a cleverly committed crime. It is fundamentally a story of profound institutional missteps, a catastrophic contamination of the crime scene, and a long, damaging war waged between multiple law enforcement agencies. The missteps began immediately on the morning of December 26, 1996. The initial classification of the crime as a kidnapping, rather than a homicide, set the Boulder Police Department on a disastrous course. The police failed to secure the house, allowed dozens of people to enter and compromise the crime scene, and most critically, they failed to conduct a proper, thorough search of the residence, which ultimately led to John Ramsey being the one to find his daughter's body in the basement. This initial negligence destroyed any chance of collecting pristine, uncontaminated evidence. Beyond the crime scene failure, the Boulder Police quickly adopted a devastating investigative dogma known as tunnel vision. Driven by the bizarre ransom note and the Ramseys' initial reluctance to submit to a full, immediate interview, the police focused almost exclusively on the parents, John and Patsy. This singular focus led to the systematic rejection or minimization of any physical evidence that suggested an alternative scenario, specifically the intruder theory. Evidence such as the broken basement window, the cobweb, and the existence of the foreign male DNA were either downplayed, explained away, or not pursued with the necessary investigative zeal. The internal conflict within the investigation became public and crippling. The tension between the Boulder Police Department, BPD, and the Boulder District Attorney's Office, DA, was legendary. The BPD believed they had sufficient circumstantial evidence to prosecute Patsy Ramsey, but the DA's office, particularly under Alex Hunter, was hesitant, citing the lack of definitive, physical evidence connecting the parents to the final act of the murder. This impasse led to a breakdown of trust, a constant leak of conflicting information to the media, and a failure to form a cohesive strategy. Furthermore, when independent experts, most notably the legendary detective Lou Smith, were brought in, their findings, which consistently pointed toward an intruder, were often met with resistance or outright hostility from the BPD, leading to Smith's highly public and damaging resignation. The investigative timeline became a revolving door of grand jury proceedings that failed to return indictments, public exonerations that the police refused to fully accept, and a continuous cycle of political pressure. The police were heavily criticized for their lack of experience with complex homicide cases, particularly those involving such a high-profile, wealthy family, leading to accusations that they were overwhelmed, inexperienced, and ultimately outmaneuvered by the Ramseys' legal team. Decades later, the case remains officially unsolved, a direct result of the foundational failures in the first 24 hours and the subsequent, persistent refusal of the original investigative team to look beyond their initial, deeply flawed assumptions. The primary challenge for any modern attempt to solve the case is not finding new evidence, but overcoming the lasting damage done by the institutional missteps and the persistent interagency conflict that has plagued the investigation since Christmas 1996. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey transcended true crime. It became a cultural event, a perpetual national obsession that continues to haunt America's collective memory nearly 30 years later. The case's enduring power is rooted in a toxic alchemy of wealth, beauty, media exploitation, and a staggering failure of justice that spoke to the deepest societal anxieties of the late 20th century. For the public, the case became a Rorschach test, reflecting individual biases about wealth, parenting, and American excess. The image of the child beauty queen, heavily made up and performing for applause, immediately polarized a nation. To many, the Ramseys' lifestyle, particularly the pageantry, symbolized a kind of corrosive, performative American ambition that they believed was inherently corrupt or exploitative, making the parents immediately guilty in the court of public opinion, regardless of the physical evidence. The relentless and often sensational media coverage amplified this toxicity. The Ramseys, driven by their powerful legal team and a perceived failure of the police to protect their privacy, adopted a defensive posture, communicating primarily through carefully managed media interviews and legal statements. This perceived secretiveness, combined with the initial police focus on them, solidified the public's conviction that they were hiding something. Every detail, Patsy's theatrical handwriting, John's hurried removal of the body, Burke's quiet demeanor, was dissected, magnified, and interpreted as evidence of guilt. The media's insatiable hunger for details transformed the Ramseys' home into a globally recognized symbol of murder and mystery, and JonBenét herself became a tragic cultural icon, her image, the 6-year-old in a crown, synonymous with the failure of the justice system. The case also fundamentally altered the relationship between local police departments and high-profile suspects. The Boulder bubble narrative, the idea that the police were inexperienced and intimidated by the Ramseys' wealth and influence, became a cautionary tale taught in police academies and law schools, illustrating the dangers of underpreparedness and media management in high-stakes investigations. Furthermore, the case highlighted profound and often contradictory power of forensic science. The DNA evidence, which should have been a clear pathway to resolution, instead became a source of even deeper debate, a battleground between the undeniable science of the unknown male profile and persistent circumstantial theories pointing toward the family. The sheer ambiguity has allowed the public to perpetually solve the case according to their own predilections, maintaining the mystery and ensuring its continued presence in documentaries, podcasts, and online forums. JonBenét Ramsey's murder remains a deep scar because it represents a complete breakdown of the social contract. The belief that innocence is protected, that law enforcement is competent, and that the truth will ultimately prevail. The fact that the killer has walked free for decades, despite the overwhelming attention and advanced technology, serves as a constant, haunting reminder of the limits of justice and the possibility that, sometimes, the truth can be permanently buried beneath layers of contamination, speculation, and media noise. This dark legacy ensures that the file, though cold, will never be truly closed in the mind of the American public. The enduring pursuit of justice in the JonBenét Ramsey case now hinges entirely on the promise of advanced forensic science and persistent efforts to make the full, unredacted case file fully transparent to independent experts. For decades, the investigation was mired in secrecy, political infighting, and selective release of information, but recent years have seen a powerful push of complete opening of the case files, fueled by new legal pressures and the dramatic advancements in DNA technology. The public release of specific documents, particularly the grand jury transcripts that detailed the secret proceedings against the Ramseys, offered a crucial, albeit complex, look into the evidence the police and prosecutors had gathered. These documents revealed that the grand jury, while voting to indict John and Patsy on charges related to child abuse resulting in death and obstruction of justice, the district attorney at the time refused to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence to secure conviction. This revelation only solidified the ambiguity, a near-miss legal attempt that failed to settle the question of culpability. However, the most significant hope for resolution lies in genetic genealogy. This powerful technique, which has successfully solved numerous cold cases across the United States, involves taking existing unknown male DNA profile and uploading it to public genealogy databases with a warrant to find distant relatives of the killer. By building a complex family tree backward in time, investigators can narrow the search field down to a single person or a small group of brothers, offering a tangible path to identifying a man whose DNA was found under JonBenét's nails and on her clothes. This method requires cooperation and resources, but it represents the most viable path to definitively naming the killer. Furthermore, the push for full transparency continues. John Ramsey, now an aging father who lost his daughter and later his wife, has publicly and repeatedly advocated for the case files, all evidence, documents, and transcripts to be handed over to a private, non-governmental, third-party cold case team that possesses the advanced forensic capabilities and political independence that the original Boulder Police Department lacked. He argues that only by taking the case out of the hands of the original, emotionally and politically compromised jurisdiction can a genuine, objective breakthrough be achieved. Modern forensic testing is also focused on re-examining other trace evidence that was previously considered too degraded or minute for analysis. This includes fibers found near the body, other hair samples, and residue from the garrote and duct tape. The hope is that breakthroughs in microanalysis technology can extract secondary DNA profiles or provide conclusive links that were scientifically impossible in the late 1990s. The full file, therefore, represents the last frontier in the JonBenét Ramsey investigation. It is a massive collection of compromised evidence, conflicting theories, and decades of legal maneuvering. But within that complex file lies the potential for a small, conclusive, uncontaminated piece of information, a single genetic sequence that, when paired with modern technology, can finally shatter the decades of silence and close the haunting chapter of the Christmas morning murder. The world is watching and waiting for the moment when technology can finally redeem the catastrophic failures of human judgment that defined the first years of this tragic case. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey is more than a cold case. It is a permanent fixture in the American consciousness, a spectral reminder of a childhood stolen and a justice system profoundly derailed by chaos, conflict, and contamination. Decades have passed, but the questions remain as raw and intense as they were on that devastating morning in 1996. Who wrote the bizarre, 3-page ransom note? Was the elaborate staging the desperate act of an intruder trying to conceal a sexual assault, or the pathological cover-up of a parent trying to hide a fatal, accidental act of rage? And most critically, who is the owner of the unknown male DNA? The singular, objective piece of evidence that still silently screams the killer's identity? The legacy of the JonBenét Ramsey case is not one of criminal brilliance. It is a tragic tale of institutional failure, the catastrophic contamination of the crime scene, the persistent police tunnel vision that excluded key evidence, and the destructive public war waged against the Ramsey family have all contributed to an insurmountable wall of doubt that the killer has hidden behind for nearly 3 decades. The tragedy of JonBenét Ramsey's short life and violent death is compounded by the ongoing failure to achieve legal accountability. The full file remains officially open, a painful wound for the Ramsey family, the Boulder community, and a nation that has watched the drama unfold in agonizing slow motion. But as we transition into the next generation of forensic technology, there is a renewed, powerful hope. The advancements in genetic genealogy and the growing legal pressure to release the full case files to objective, independent analysts offer the most viable path to resolution. The key is no longer in finding new evidence, but in applying revolutionary science to the evidence that has been waiting patiently in the freezer for decades, the microscopic touch DNA of the person who is truly responsible. Called to action. The responsibility for solving this enduring mystery now falls to the next generation of investigators, forensic scientists, and most importantly, the public. The Boulder Police Department continues to insist that they are actively working the case, but the greatest hope often lies outside the compromised official channels. If you have any knowledge, any detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, that relates to this case, if you know anyone who lived in the Boulder area, who was involved in the pageant world, or whose DNA profile might be a familial match to the evidence, you hold the key to finally bringing closure to this American tragedy. We urge the responsible agencies to use every modern genetic genealogy tool available. We urge the public to come forward with any information. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old when her life was violently taken. For 30 years, she has waited for justice. The full file is open, the DNA is waiting, and the truth is still attainable. The time for answers is now. If you want to follow the absolute latest developments in the JonBenét Ramsey case, including new forensic testing and investigative breakthroughs, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We are committed to following this case until the final, definitive answer is found.